Hey, it's Anita. We're revisiting one of our favorite episodes from 2023 about getting an autism diagnosis as an adult. We explore why it's harder for folks assigned female at birth to get these diagnoses, and how learning a name for something you've experienced your whole life changes your relationship with yourself. We hope you enjoy listening back.
Hey, Amanda Magnus here, the executive producer of Embodied. Each week on the show, we introduce you to interesting people and bring you into intimate topics that inspire meaningful conversations. But these episodes are only possible with the support of our community, and that includes you. Make a contribution to the public radio station that supports our work, WUNC, so that we can continue to bring you the stories you can't find anywhere else. Give as generously as you can at WUNC.org, and thank you.
There was nothing easy about 2020. You don't need me to remind you that every system, structure, and norm we relied on was disrupted almost overnight. I'm someone who thrives on routine and carefully crafted plans, so that era was very uncomfortable. But I moved through it with a lot of privilege. My job was steady and could be done remotely, I had no kids to care for, and I had the support of a therapist and anxiety medication. It was in this era, however, that I first really started using TikTok and became acutely aware of what other people my age in this country were going through. One theme that emerged over and over again on mental health talk and beyond was that this total world upheaval allowed many of us to see ourselves in ways we never had before. This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. Without the pressure and expectation to show up to an in-person office job, some people realized just how depleting that kind of social contact was. Others noticed that without access to coping strategies they'd long relied on, they couldn't make it through the day. This led some folks to seeking formal psychological diagnoses, and others to platforms like TikTok or YouTube, where they started sharing their stories.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So on today's episode, I wanted to talk about the topic of friendship and communities and how that can affect someone with autism. So let's get into it.
That's Irene Chan on her YouTube channel, The Thought Spot. Although Irene had spent years working with autistic children and adults, she never considered that she might be autistic until the pandemic. COVID lockdowns gave her the time and space to get introspective and start investigating some of the things she was struggling with. She first got an ADHD diagnosis, but when she began treating her ADHD, her autistic traits started to rise to the surface. Irene was living with a partner at the time who pointed out what was happening.
If he would make me coffee and bring it to me, I would genuinely tell him to remake it in another cup, which is my coffee cup, because I didn't want to drink it from just any cup. It had to be in a certain mug. And if I wasn't able to do something a certain way, it would make me feel extremely uncomfortable. And I would go out of my way to make sure that I could do the same things the same way every time. And so that in combination with, I started to get a lot of TikToks on my For You page of other women who were late diagnosed talking about their experience. And I think it was just like a light bulb that went off. And at that point, it was a matter of just seeking an assessment and diagnosis. It was just very quick for me.
There is an activist, I think, an autistic activist who has this quote that says, if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. And I know that you know that quote and you've thought a lot about that. And I'm curious about how you kind of connect that to how you were able to identify things that resonated for you. Like, what was it about the representation that you were seeing that you felt like you could finally connect with that you maybe hadn't been able to before?
Yeah, so the specific creator that I watched that had me realize that I'm autistic was, I think her name is Lena. And I think she's also Asian American. And just seeing the way she talked and her experiences, it just resonated a lot with me. And there's a lot of things in my life that I'd never really had answers to. Just little things like always being generally confused about social situations. And I've always chopped it up to just having social anxiety or not understanding things, and it's somehow my fault. Just these very simplistic excuses. And I feel like when I saw someone like her and I, for the first time, saw that it was possible for someone like her to be autistic, it just kind of made a lot of sense for me.
That account Irene mentioned is run by an autistic therapist named Lena Fang. One of the things Lena talks a lot about is how autism can present differently in people assigned female at birth. Criteria for autism, however, are based on data almost entirely from studies of boys, so it can be really hard for women and AFAB people to get a diagnosis. This reality has led to a certain level of acceptance around self-diagnosis in the autism community, which is something that Irene is familiar with.
I just want to first say that everyone's experiences with diagnosis is valid just because it's so difficult. For me, I wanted a formal diagnosis because just coming from the background I come from, having these formal labels, I think it somehow validates your experience more. It feels a lot more valid for me to be able to not only speak on the topic, but also identify with the label as well.
Was it hard for you to get that formal diagnosis and find that supportive medical provider?
I would say it's very difficult because, first of all, there's not much information out there on how to start that journey. I remember first bringing it up to my psychiatrist at the time, and she at the time said I could maintain conversation with her really well. I seemed to have relationships with people. I seemed to have an eye for interior design. And things like that aren't what autistic people are capable of. And so I was kind of left in the dark on my own. And I had to really, truly deep dive and hyper focus on looking for a practitioner to be able to perform the assessment. And then I hit another wall because everything out there is mostly geared towards children. And when I finally did find places that were able to assess adults, it was places that were hours and hours away. Of course, there's other barriers like insurance, and then there's the wait list as well. So sometimes these clinics have wait lists that last up to a few years. And so these were all barriers that I had to try to overcome on my own in the process of seeking diagnosis.
So that is such a long journey and a long road that you went down, and you did finally get a diagnosis. And it's only been a couple of years since that moment, but you've done a lot of excavating of yourself and of your childhood and of your experiences, and you talk a lot about this on your YouTube channel. And there's one video in particular that I want to ask you about, which is you and your mom sitting down together and talking about what it was like for her to raise you and what you're reflecting on now as an adult that you experienced in your childhood. And one of the things that your mom says is she says that you were a kid who threw a lot of temper tantrums. And you take this moment to kind of educate her about autism meltdowns and how you are now processing the way that you were as a kid. Tell me a little bit about what you shared with her and what it was like to have that conversation.
Yeah, so that video, when we first filmed it, I remember being very closed off emotionally to be able to get through the conversation because, of course, the topics we're talking about are very personal and could be very triggering. So it wasn't until I was editing the video where I started to feel very emotional and begin to cry. I felt like much of my life I've heard from people like my parents or just other people, just this general sense of blaming. You're always wrong for doing certain things or not being able to withstand certain experiences like other kids or other people. And I think for a lot of high-masking autistic individuals, we tend to develop a deep sense of shame and just always feeling like you're wrong somehow, but not necessarily knowing why or not necessarily understanding why it's wrong. And so when I was able to finally explain to my mom, what an autistic meltdown was, it felt very cathartic, but I felt like it was mostly for me. I don't even know if it affected her the way that it did to me.
Cultural representation of autism has historically been super narrow. Think young white boys or the Sheldon Cooper type. This is why the internet has been so huge for some autistic folks who are finally able to see other people with autism who look and act like they do.
The other day, I posted a video on TikTok asking Black autistics to comment something they wish people knew. Here are the results of those comments. Autistic does not mean stupid or slow. I wish people knew how hard it is for me to talk. The act of communicating and using the right tone is exhausting. I just want to be mute. Black parents need to educate themselves. Being uninformed is hurting their Black children. Masking and code switching are not the same thing, but both are exhausting, especially when doing them simultaneously. I am able to do any task, just explain. I wish my family would understand that even if I don't show emotion on my face, I still feel something. No one actually knows the real me, just carefully assembled personalities that will make me seem neurotypical enough to pass.
That's Kofi Robinson, a Black autistic lawyer. She got her diagnosis when she was 21 and partway through law school. This was all in the middle of the pandemic. And while she could see that everyone around her was stressed, she noticed that the burnout that she was experiencing was different.
It was a bit difficult because, of course, we all know that law school is hard for even neurotypicals, for the average person. So to have autism on top of it was a lot. But I was able to have them differ in my mind by thinking, oh, this person is stressed out about an exam, but they don't have a meltdown when they hear a specific person's voice. I was absolutely in burnout because I was depressed for weeks. This wasn't something that went away. It was just very intense. It was hard to get out of bed. It was hard to eat. It was hard to focus. And I was very dissociated by then. It was much more intense than the average law student.
You had done some digging at that point to learn a little bit about other people who got later in life autism diagnoses. And this experience is that a lot of people who are assigned female at birth have undiagnosed autism for a long time. One study estimated that like 80% of people who are assigned female at birth with autism remain undiagnosed when they're 18. So you knew this. You knew some of the data.
Yes.
And all of that informed kind of how you showed up to your appointment where you were getting the diagnosis. So talk to me about that. How did it inform that experience for you?
Oh, it was shocking. It was shocking to stumble upon that statistic, but it made sense. It just made so much sense, the way that we are shaped to go about society, always suffering internally, never externally, or especially for a Black woman being called like sassy or you have a bad attitude. There's a lot of that.
I want to talk to you about this concept of masking that you all have both brought up. Irene, I know that you went through a process soon after learning more about autism where you started to unmask and think about the masks that you were bringing to your interactions. Tell me about that and what you uncovered about yourself.
I actually started to unmask years before my diagnosis, but of course, at the time, I didn't know I was unmasking. It was just, I had such chronic fatigue all the time. And I think this is where the disability comes in. There's moments where you, even if you have to or want to, can't uphold certain aspects of your life anymore. And I hit a point where all I could really maintain was to show up at work. I didn't have a social life and I couldn't mask. So if that meant I would show up to work and not say hi to any of my coworkers or have any conversation, that's what I did. And I noticed that as I was unmasking at these work settings, I was experiencing a lot of ableism, a lot of alienation, a lot of judgments. And at the time, I wasn't diagnosed, so I just thought to myself, well, I guess I am a standoffish person. I'm someone that's hard to get along with. I kind of accepted these negative labels, and it was just because I was too tired to do anything about it anymore. And after I was finally diagnosed, it wasn't necessarily that I was finally unmasking. It was just this experience of I could finally let go of these negative labels that even I was holding above my own head, and allow myself to actually just be and to exist and not feel guilty about it.
Kofi, you after you got your diagnosis, you spent the summer doing an internship at a law firm. And I'd love to know how having that knowledge of your diagnosis changed how you approached work and any accommodations that you asked for.
I did not come out as autistic at work. If someone discovers it, stumbles upon it online, that's their business. I don't think that I want to discuss it at work because it usually doesn't end well. Even though there are laws in place for us, technically, I think that people can have roundabout ways of discriminating against us and do. But because of my diagnosis, I am more aware and understanding of the way I appear on the outside, such as my tone, if I'm being too blunt. If I ever need to mask, then I can, but for the most part, it was a professional work environment. It's not loud. It's a law office. What was expected of me wasn't much different than the person who I am. I have a strong sense of justice. I'm straight to the point. I'm logical, detail-oriented. Those are all things that you want in a lawyer.
Yeah, there are a lot of traits that you kind of marked in yourself that were advantageous in this law school career and this law school experience. How did the process of unmasking kind of shape how you thought about your own identity and your own personality?
It was difficult. Unmasking can be very difficult at first. You have to sort of figure out where you end and the mask begins, and you have to figure out what you like, what your boundaries are, and who you really are all over again. I would sometimes mask if I need it, but that's what masking is. It's a defense mechanism. Otherwise, I try not to mask just because it takes so much energy. It's so draining. But I learned how not to mask by trying to figure out who I was when I was alone. I think that's something that really helped.
Irene, you talked a little bit about reflecting back on your previous work experiences, and you noticed that you've been drawn to a lot of customer service jobs and customer service roles, which do involve a lot of social interaction. I'm curious about why you think you're particularly drawn to those roles.
I feel like I was drawn to a lot of customer service type of jobs because I think intrinsically I am a very empathetic person that wants to connect with other people. But I feel like connecting with other people was very difficult for me. I think unconsciously I found myself drawn to these customer service jobs because it allowed me to still interact with other people, but within the confines of rules, like a certain type of script. For example, if you're a barista, there's a certain script that you follow in order to talk to a customer, and that felt like a sense of comfort for me. And I felt like perhaps there was an aspect of me that wanted to learn through these scripts at work how to carry on conversations with others and get those needs met, but in my own personal life, spend that time by myself. And it was just kind of, I think, my way of counteracting that loneliness that does sometimes come with autism.
I'd love to ask you about that, Kofi, because you talk a lot on your TikTok page about friendships and how you think about whether or not you come out as autistic to your friends, and also that you really vet friends and you talk openly about vetting friendships. So talk to me about that and how that is part of how you manage some of your autistic traits.
Yeah, sure. So loneliness is something that I experience. It was very much that way in law school, more so because I didn't have time to do any socializing. I had so much work to do. I used to go through this really difficult cycle where I would get lonely, not really know that that's what I was feeling because of alexithymia. It's just hard to tell what your emotions are in times like that. But I also didn't want to socialize. So the best thing I did was meet other autistic people, and learn what kind of people I can be friends with. And they do go through that vetting process of I'm trying to make sure that I don't get hurt, because if this is a potentially very manipulative person, I know that I could be manipulated, and I don't want that. I want, good people. So if you go through my vetting process and I deem you a good person, then we could be friends.
You mentioned alexithymia. That's when a person has difficulty experiencing, identifying, and expressing emotions, which
Yes.
is a big part of friendship. I know is building friendship, is being able to know what other people feel and think and have that dynamic. Irene, how has masking shown up in your friendships, and how have your friends shown up for you since learning about your autism diagnosis?
Yeah, so I was very intensely masking in my friendships for most of my life. And of course, that has a lot of effects on you. I think on the surface, it just looks like I was never a part of one group. I was always hopping around from one group to another. And I think it's because I could maybe mask just enough for surface level interactions, but not enough to be able to see the same people really often. I would hit these walls, like these energy deficits, where I wouldn't be able to maintain the friendships anymore. Because a lot of the times when you're masking so heavily in your friendships, it creates a very one-sided dynamic where you're kind of just there to serve the other person. And that's kind of the concept of masks. It's built for the person you're interacting with. And so I think much of my life I felt very lonely because I wasn't able to maintain these friendships. And after the diagnosis, like I said, I was already unmasking years before. And so the few friends I did have in my life at that point were already people that were pretty comfortable with my autistic traits, even though at the time none of us knew they were autistic traits, but just they knew Irene doesn't necessarily have this high bubbly energy, and they just respect that. And so I would say after the diagnosis, it's helped a lot because I could actually go to them and say, these are things that I struggle with as an autistic person. I could educate them, and they will go out of their way to ask me ways that they could accommodate to me within the friendship. And I don't think I've ever had that before. Another person asking me how I need to show up and how they could show up for me.
Hi, my name is Catherine. I've always felt different, but I never knew why. By my late 50s, I was dealing with extreme social anxiety and frequent sensory overload. With my lifelong fascination with numbers and patterns, I wondered if I could be autistic. One expert told me, no, I was too easy to talk to. She didn't realize how exhausting it was for me.
My name is Sarah. I never suspected that I was autistic. It wasn't until I started seeing a counselor for my depression that she noticed certain signs, and that's when I chose to pursue a formal diagnosis. I was 32 at the time of my diagnosis. As far as how it impacted my life, it really just made sense of everything.
This summer, I joined an online community for late diagnosed autistic people. We each have unique lives, but we all struggle with the same things. And I finally know I am autistic.
This is who I am, and this is why I'm this way. I am just not a strange person. I am autistic, and it kind of helped me develop a better identity of myself. The only thing that I was upset about was the fact that my diagnosis came so late in life, and I did not receive the therapies and other things that could have actually made my childhood, young adulthood, and adulthood a little bit easier.
Feeling sadness and grief after a later in life autism diagnosis is relatively common, and something that Jenny Chapman also experienced when they got a diagnosis at age 25.
It almost felt like years that were lost because things could have been so different had I had that information.
Jenny is a queer, non-binary actor and photographer who has documented a lot of their reflections about getting an autism diagnosis on Instagram. One of their posts that I found super interesting drew parallels between coming out as queer and coming out as autistic.
We're referring to it as coming out as autistic. And what I realized was that they were the same steps. First, you get like a little inkling, right? You start realizing that you're not quite like other people in a certain way. And maybe you take the, am I gay quizzes online, or you look for autism, like diagnostic quizzes, and you start going, okay, like this is really me. Oh my gosh. And then you have to get to the point where you maybe want to tell some people, but you have to gauge, first of all, who you're going to tell first, how you're going to tell them, and how you're going to cope with potentially a more negative reaction. Coming out as autistic, especially as an AFAB person, like people were straight up like, no, you're not. And I was like, oh my God, thank you for letting me know. Like I went through all of this and thanks for, okay, bye. And I grew up doing theater. I still do theater. And I think I learned a lot about how to mask and how to act neurotypical through theater, not just interactions with my peers who were doing the shows, but also just through character work. I think I have done a lifelong character study of neurotypical people and how to mimic their mannerisms and their tone of voice and all of that. But that all connecting back to coming out and having to come out all the time.
Yeah.
Both as queer and as autistic. And you have to constantly gauge the acceptance or level of safety that you feel with the people that you're with, and how much you're going to mask or not mask, or display PDA with your partner or not.
Well, I want to ask you about your partner a little bit.
Yeah.
So you got this diagnosis when you all worked together. The two of you have been together for more than 6 years. You recently got married.
Yeah. Yes, we did.
I'm curious about how getting the diagnosis has given you language and a framework for y'all's romantic relationship, what you all have begun to unpack and piece together since getting the diagnosis.
Yeah. I mean, we've been together honestly slightly more than half of our relationship before any diagnoses were happening. And we were just aggressively trying to love each other and support as best we could. My wife has ADHD, which she actually found out more recently than my diagnosis. So there was this shared neurodivergent understanding, even though we didn't have words to describe that yet. But after my diagnosis, and then of course after hers, we're able to understand why our brains work certain ways. I like to think of people's brains as like computer software. We all have word processors. We all have, an internet browser, but the code to make those different things happen is different depending on what type of brain you have. And the diagnoses for me especially were the key to understanding the way that my brain code worked. And so I could understand and explain it to her. So we were able to find ways to mutually support each other much quicker because we actually had the ingredients of understanding why things were happening or misfiring.
Have there been particular things that you have asked of your wife or that you all have been able to navigate in the context of touch and sensory things related to your autistic traits in this phase since getting a diagnosis?
Yeah. My main love language is physical touch. And that doesn't even necessarily have to be sexual. Like it's just, skin to skin pressure, like any sort of hug or, petting my hair or whatever. Like that is really good for me. And that is not my wife's love language at all. And so being able to take it beyond just like, this is my preference, but also see it through the autistic lens of like, to regulate myself in not only in moments where I'm feeling happy and okay, but in moments where I'm really upset and maybe not quite verbal and not able to express what I need. That's a go-to for her that is going to be successful every time. We're now going very objectively going, this is what works for me. Let's try this. And being able to step outside what is maybe the first thing you'd think of to do because it's what you'd prefer, to be able to love each other better.
I know that you and your wife want to have a kid, and you've begun to talk about preparing for that process, which is, I don't have a kid, but I know is like the epitome of overload in every single way. So how are you all thinking through that and building systems that will hopefully serve you in those higher stress moments?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I am not the one that is going to get pregnant. I've never wanted to be pregnant. I resigned myself to a childless life until I met her. And she's always wanted to carry. And so, one and done. We're very happy we figured that out. But we're trying things out now that can accommodate specifically me, but also her now, that can translate to the ultimate sensory overload of having a young child. I have these, they're called loop earplugs that are really fancy technology that I can actually understand you quite clearly if you're right in front of me speaking to me, but the background noise is incredibly muted. And that's been very helpful in, like, if you and I are speaking and there's music playing in the background, I cannot form a sentence. But also that's going to be really helpful when we have a newborn that is screaming all of the time, and making less frequent the times when I need to take a break and step out for a second, which will allow me to be a more present parent. And so trying to think of those systems as much as we can ahead of time so that we can not only give our kid their best shot, but also give us our best shot to be impactful, as regulated as possible parents.
I love how Jenny and her wife are identifying accommodations now to support their future selves, serious life and relationship goals. Jenny has also done a lot of work to build in accommodations for themselves in their professional life. She schedules her photography business in a way that gives her the flexibility to take a break if she's having a tough sensory day. And she's identified what things can make their acting experience more comfortable, like no rough name tags in the back of her costumes. If you're listening to this and wondering about how to support yourself or someone in your life who's recently gotten an autism diagnosis, here's Jenny's advice.
It can be jarring to learn that information about yourself, even if you've sort of suspected it for a long time. And the thing that was key for me was realizing that it's just a reframing of what was already there the whole time. And I quite liked myself before my diagnosis. I think I'm a cool person. And it's not like this illness that you contract or something that is wrong with you. The autism itself, at least in my mind, is not the disability. The disability is having to exist in a world that isn't built for you. If autistic minds had built the world, neurotypicals would be the ones that are disabled. And so in the end, it became a reframing of my own concept of myself. And I went, okay, well, if I liked myself before, I was autistic before, I just didn't know. So by the transitive property, like, I have to continue to love myself now because it's the same person. I just have more information. I have a user manual. And then how that translates to romantic partners or friendships is now you have the user manual on how you can be a good friend to others and how others can be a good friend to you. You end up making better friendships and better partnerships because of the additional information that you have about your brain and how you work.
Embodied is a production of North Carolina Public Radio WUNC, a listener-supported station. If you want to lend your support to this podcast, consider a contribution at WUNC.org now. You can find more about everyone we talked to in this episode in the show notes. And I also want to give a special thanks to Sarah and Catherine for sharing their stories with us. This episode was produced by Gabriella Glick and edited by Amanda Magnus. Kaya Finlay and Paige Miranda also produced for our show. Skylar Chadwick is our intern, and Jenny Lawson is our sound engineer. Quilla wrote our theme music. Thank you so much for listening to Embodied. And if you like this show, please spread the word in your own networks. Word of mouth recommendations are the best way to support our podcast, and we so appreciate it. Until next time, I'm Anita Rao, taking on the taboo with you.